Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us tonight for this very important and special evening. Tonight we'll be hosting an event which is hosted by the Community Church of Boston. For the many in attendance who already know, and for some who might not know, Community Church of Boston was founded in 1920. And in the past over 100 years, we've had many important, significant speakers. Some of these speakers include Martin Luther King Jr., W.E.B. Du Bois, who spoke with Community Church many times, actually. In fact, if you go on the church's YouTube channel, you'll find a talk that W.E.B. Du Bois gave to the Community Church in 1959 titled Life in Socialist Lands, which he gave a talk to us after returning from the Soviet Union and from China. So we have a very long history, and our tradition of inviting prominent and renowned speakers to speak on the most important issues of the day is a tradition we continue tonight. I'm very excited and very much looking forward to listening to our guest of honor tonight, Professor Norman Finkelstein. Will be speaking about one of the most important issues of our time, the genocide in Gaza. Professor Norman Finkelstein received his doctorate from Princeton University Department of Politics. He's written many books, and they've been translated into many languages. I'll just name two of his books. One of them is called I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It. Another one of his books is Gaza, an Inquest into Its Martyrdom. Professor Finkelstein has written and spoken about this topic extensively, even to the point where many have tried to assassinate his character and derail his career, and yet he's still stuck to his principles. So for me, it's a big honor to introduce and to welcome Professor Norman Finkelstein. Professor, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm not sure yet how long I will go. I will try to keep your interest, and when it seems like I've gone on beyond what's reasonable in a Zoom-type format, then we'll just switch to questions and answers wherever I happen to be in my presentation. Officially, the events which reached a climax this past week, officially they began on October 7th with the Hamas attack on southern Israel. And in the course of the past 15 months, I would say there are two aspects to the unfolding events which have given rise to controversy. Or I should say two aspects, one of which I consider uncontroversial, and the other of which I consider that reasonable people can disagree. Let's start with the uncontroversial aspect. I would say it's uncontroversial that Israel, in the course of the past 15 months, has committed horrendous crimes in Gaza, in many respects unprecedented for the 20th century, and in some respects unprecedented going as far back as World War II. I don't think any serious individual can contest the fact that horrendous crimes have occurred. How do I reach that conclusion? On what basis do I reach that conclusion? I would put forth the following argument. In past conflicts in the Israel Palestine situation in past armed confrontations. The documentation relied on was usually human rights reports. There were the Amnesty International reports, there were the Human Rights Watch reports, and then there were the reports of local human rights organizations, such as B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, and the various Palestinian human rights organizations, Al-Haq, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, and so forth. Now, it was claimed, in my opinion, wholly without justification, but we'll set that aside. It was claimed that these organizations had a quote-unquote pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel bias. That was the claim. As I said, I believe that claim has no foundation whatsoever, but that was the claim. The past 15 months has been unusual because for the first time, the human rights organizations, even though they have been active and have produced a significant amount of documentation, the human rights organizations were not the main source of information. On the contrary, the main source of information were the various international humanitarian organizations, which, because Gaza has been economically devastated since 2006, these organizations, these humanitarian organizations, have all set up shop in Gaza. And so, when we judge the quality and the accuracy and the integrity of the various organizations supplying data on the situation in Gaza, we've almost entirely, as I said, the human rights organizations have produced significant documentation, but they have not been the main source. The main source has been places like Save the Children, World Health Organization, Doctors Without Borders, UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And then there are the various human rights and humanitarian organizations, which are integral to or adjuncts to the United Nations. And so, in my opinion, when you look at the sources of the documentation, if I can give one simple example, if you look at the South African application to the International Court of Justice in January 2024, to be precise, I think it was December 29th, 2023, but we'll call it January 2024. That application, it contained literally over 300 footnotes. It was attempting to document, for those of you who might not be familiar with the proceedings, the South African delegation, a South African delegation, went before the International Court of Justice in January 2024. It presented what it called an application, which ran to 84 single-spaced pages, and as I said, well over 300 footnotes, and each of the footnotes itself contained multiple references to various reports and updates on the situation in Gaza. Now, what was very striking in that South African application was that, except for an occasional reference, and I mean occasional, reference to Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, apart from an occasional reference, the entire documentation adduced by South Africa in its attempt to demonstrate that Israel was carrying out a genocide in Gaza, virtually all its documentation in order to prove that claim that Israel was carrying out a genocide in Gaza, virtually all the documentation came from various humanitarian organizations or adjuncts or offices integral to the United Nations, starting with the UN Secretary General Guterres on down to the various organizations, as I said, which had already set up operations which were ongoing in Gaza. Now, I will make one more point on that, which is, if you look at the documentation, there is very little disagreement among these humanitarian organizations, UNESCO, UNICEF, Save the Children, World Health Organization, and on and on. There's very little disagreement about what's going on there. There is, I dare say, and I will say, there is no controversy. So, on the factual question, on questions which typically come up, is Israel indiscriminately bombing and indiscriminately firing artillery in Gaza? Is Israel targeting journalists? Is Israel targeting medics? Is Israel targeting UN workers? Is Israel targeting children? Is Israel targeting hospitals? Is Israel targeting the most basic infrastructure in Gaza, their infrastructure that provides water, electricity, and so forth? Is Israel targeting it? On those questions, which a lot of our mainstream media would have you believe there is controversy, The controversy reduces to this: what Israel alleges versus what virtually, and I'm not even comfortable using the qualifier virtually, I think even that understates the consensus. So I'll say what Israel alleges versus what the entire gamut of respected human rights organizations, including, by the way, many headed by Americans and many headed by people who are of Jewish descent, what all these organizations claim. Now, to my thinking, that is not controversy, because under the normal canons of law, there's a principle called evidence with and versus evidence without interest. That's a very simple concept. It means if you provide evidence that buttresses your cause or your, so to speak, side, if you provide evidence which buttresses your side, it's taken with a grain of salt or more because it's evidence with interest versus evidence without interest, namely evidence which doesn't buttress either side, assuming there are two sides, doesn't buttress either side in a particular instance. So Israel's quote unquote evidence is evidence with interest, whereas there's no discernible interest by these humanitarian organizations, let alone a collective interest such that you find unanimity across the board. There is little, if any, and I honestly can't think of any dissent on the fundamental questions. I just referred you to several of them: the targeting of medics, journalists, UN workers, the targeting of children, the targeting of hospitals, or to take another example, the use of starvation as a method of war. There is simply no dissent whatsoever. There is no dissent whatsoever that Israel's using starvation as a method of war, aside again from the dissent articulated by Israel, which doesn't count or not much weight is normally given to attestations or evidence with interest. So, on the factual questions, I would say there is no real controversy about what's been unfolding in Gaza. There are some technical points. For those of you who follow developments closely, there was a technical point about whether or not what the people in Gaza and later the people in the northern part of Gaza, were they experiencing food insecurity, hunger, starvation, or famine. And those are very technical terms. difficult for a layperson, at any rate, someone like myself, difficult to grasp the technical points which distinguish each of these delineations: food insecurity versus extreme food insecurity versus hunger versus starvation versus famine. And there was some controversy, but if you're not a technician, it didn't really amount to much. There was clearly serious hunger in Gaza, serious malnutrition in Gaza, and numbers of people perished from the lack of food. So there you could say there was some element of controversy, but really on such fine technical points that they are not, in my opinion, of any general interest. It's not as if a normal layperson would say, oh, it's just starvation, it's not famine. Those sorts of distinctions they're actually quite, in the context of what's happening, they're actually quite lunatic. But as a technical point, I suppose they have some significance. On the other hand, so just to clarify my own view, I would say on the factual questions, there's very little controversy. And where there is controversy, it's on very technical points of no great interest to a broad public or to a person who has a conscience. But then there's a second group of questions where I do believe there is legitimate difference of opinion. And I will name 3 examples of what I think are legitimate areas of disagreement. Point number 1, should Hamas have been condemned without qualification for what happened on October 7th? Is it a prerequisite, so to speak, for joining the conversation? Is it a necessary prerequisite for joining the conversation that each would-be participant, that he or she condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? And as you can imagine, and as you all know, because no doubt you've had conversations on that topic with your family, friends, and professional colleagues, and if you're part of the leftist tradition, with your comrades. The second point of disagreement, where, in my opinion, reasonable people can disagree, is whether or not Israel had what is called a right to self-defense. Or, as it's sometimes put, what did you expect Israel to do? And that entails 2 aspects of that question. Number 1, whether or not Israel was exercising a right to self-defense, or whether in the guise of exercising a right to self-defense, Israel was actually carrying out a genocide. The genocide was, it's argued, the genocide was disguised as self-defense. But that doesn't exhaust the question, because you can still argue that even if Israel was exploiting its right to self-defense in order to carry out a genocide, still it did have a right to self-defense. So that's the second question where reasonable people, I believe, can disagree. And then there is a third question, which can appear to be technical, but in my opinion is actually quite important. And that question is, assuming Israel is not carrying out a war of self-defense, what exactly is it doing in Gaza? Which is the question, is it a genocide? And right there too, in my opinion, there are two aspects to it. The first aspect is a technical one. Does it qualify as a genocide, either as defined by the International Court of Justice, as it's defined, genocide that is, as defined by the International Court of Justice, or as defined by Oxford English Dictionary, OED? Is it a genocide? And then there's a second aspect, which is really, what difference does it make? If it were mass murder, were it a crime against humanity, were it constituting the crime against humanity that's denoted the crime of extermination, or carrying out a genocide? Is it just a technical difference that's at stake, or is there something more important that's at stake? I am of the opinion that it's not just a technical question. It's something more important that's at stake in denoting what has unfolded in Gaza as a genocide. So those are, in my opinion, the four areas where legitimate disagreement can be entertained. Those are fair questions. I don't believe the factual questions are open for serious discussion. Now, I've spoken for about a half hour. I want to, what I can do, I'll take 15 minutes more to give you my own opinion on the four areas of agreement, four areas where of disagreement in what's unfolded in the past 15 months. On the first question, do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? And should that be seen, the condemnation, should it be construed as a sine qua non, a necessary condition for being part of the conversation? Now, I am not of the opinion that what happened on October 7th was mostly perpetrated or even significantly perpetrated by Israel. The overwhelming number of deaths, the estimate is somewhere along the lines of 1,100. I think that's the last count, or 1,150, something like that. 800, more than 800 civilians, and about more than 300 combatants were killed on the Israeli side. I think they were overwhelmingly committed by Hamas, and I don't think there's, in my opinion, having read all the available information, at any rate in the English language, and it's quite voluminous, I don't think there's any serious grounds for dispute that overwhelmingly responsibility for those deaths has to be borne by Hamas and other militant groups in Gaza. So, having said that, in my opinion, which I've expressed on many occasions in the past 15 months, the closest analog to what happened on October 7th is the slave revolts in our own country and also elsewhere, for example, in Haiti. And as most of you know, the slave revolts were very bloody affairs in which large numbers of white civilians were killed. In our own country, the biggest slave revolt was the one led by Nat Turner. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's not so far from where most of you reside in Boston. It occurred in Southampton. And it was pretty brutal. The rebels, led by Nat Turner, they disemboweled men. They smashed the skulls of women. They beheaded babies. It was a gruesome affair. Nonetheless, I will add the following, not so much caveats, I will fill out the full picture. The first point I would make is the abolitionists of the time, the white abolitionists, did not condemn Nat Turner. They were not at all reluctant to describe what happened during the Nat Turner revolt as horrifying and ghastly. However, they put the burden of what happened, the burden they laid at the doorstep of white folks. As William Lloyd Garrison wrote at the time, he said, "We told you so. We warned you and warned you and warned you. If you treat people, human beings, this way, you cannot be shocked or pretend to be shocked when a revolt of the magnitude of Nat Turner's revolt happens." I found personally the most useful or illuminating statement. It came from an organization called the New York Working Men's Party. the New York Working Men's Party. And like everybody else, they described what happened during the Nat Turner Revolt as, quote, an unjustifiable atrocity. You cannot justify an atrocity of the kind that occurred during the Nat Turner Revolt. But then they went on to say, and let me quote them, of what were the South African Negroes guilty? Of putting to death men, women, and children. For what purpose? Plunder? No. There is no evidence that such was their object. On the contrary, almost all the accounts of the Nat Turner Revolt concur in stating that they expected to emancipate themselves, and they no doubt thought that their only hope of doing so, of freeing themselves, was to put to death indiscriminately the whole race of those who held them in bondage. In their minds, the only way they could free themselves from slavery was by putting to death indiscriminately the whole race of those who held them in bondage. If such were their impressions, if that's what they believed, were they not justifiable in doing so? If they believed the only way to free themselves was to put to death the whole race that held them in bondage, were they not justifiable in doing so if they believed that? And the New York Working Men's Party says, undoubtedly they were. If freedom is the birthright of men, as the Declaration of Independence tells us. So, not in any way trying to deny the magnitude of the atrocity that occurred, be it in Nat Turner or be it on October 7th, the Working Men's Party says, were they not justifiable in believing that there was no way to free themselves from this concentration camp, as Israel's head of the National Security Council described it? He described Gaza as, quote, a huge concentration camp, to which I would add, half of whom's inmates were children. Most, probably all actually, all of those who burst the gates of Gaza on October 7th had been born into that concentration camp. And so, was it not justifiable, their belief that the only way they can gain their emancipation, their, so to speak, God-given right to be free, was to indiscriminately kill the whole race that held them in bondage? That's point number one. Point number two, if you read the literature on Nat Turner, which I have, not extensive, but also not sparse, there is a scholarly literature. Black people overwhelmingly supported Nat Turner, or as they called him, Old Nat. And they called what happened during the revolt Old Nat's War. So even as white society was aghast at what happened during the Nat Turner revolt, the evidence seems to be conclusive that Black people supported him, just as the evidence seems overwhelming that the people of Gaza supported October 7th. Furthermore, the pillars of the African American freedom struggle, be it Frederick Douglass, who called Nat Turner one of our founding fathers, or be it W.E.B. Du Bois, or I should say, Douglass also called Turner one of our, quote, glorious martyrs. And Du Bois, who was mentioned in the introduction as having spoken at the church, he too recognized Nat Turner as being one, so to speak, data point on the trajectory in the freedom struggle, which climaxed in the Civil War. And thirdly, right now, not just in African American history, but in American history, Nat Turner occupies a revered place. Now, I want to make it absolutely clear what happened during the revolt is beyond extenuation. They beheaded babies and threw them in the fireplace. It was ghastly. But he's still honored. Why is he honored? In my opinion, because his driving impulses traced back to an indomitable will and an irrepressible humanity. He was a very impressive guy. For those who've read about him, Black people, white people, everyone agreed. Nat was a smart guy. He was a very smart guy. And what drove him to undertake this revolt, one historian put it, let's see if I can find it because I like the quote. Let's see. Let's see. Well, the quote, I should have already memorized it by now. It was that at core, what drove Nat Turner was this huge chasm between what he aspired to be and what he was destined to be, namely a person of very impressive intellect who probably could have achieved great things in life, but a huge chasm separated his aspirations and what he was, a slave. A slave he was born, a slave he lived, and a slave he would die. And in my view, that was the primary motivation of the young men who burst the gates of Gaza. They were born into a concentration camp. They languished in that concentration camp. And as of October 6th, they were destined to die in that concentration camp. So when you're asked the question, do you condemn what happened on October 7th? In my opinion, the proper reply would be, do you condemn Nat Turner's revolt? Do you condemn Nat Turner's revolt? As to the second question, I'm going to leave it at the second question because I could see time is passing. Namely, what was Israel to do? Or did Israel have a right to self-defense? Now, as I said, that entails two aspects. Number one, was Israel carrying out a war of self-defense? In my opinion, and we can get to that in questions and answers, in my opinion, the self-defense aspect was trivial next to the aspect of trying to once and for all solve the Gaza question by committing a genocide in Gaza. However, let's look at the question, was it, even if it were a war of self-defense, did they have that right? So I will put this question to you, and you decide for yourself. So there's a woman married to a fellow who brutalizes her, who beats her, who torments her day in and day out for 2 decades. The blockade of Gaza began in 2006. We're now at 2025. For 2 decades, the woman is beaten, tormented, brutalized, tortured. She lets out screams and yells of agony at her situation, hoping to arouse the conscience and then the intervention of her neighbors. Some people are sympathetic, but nobody does anything. And then finally, she summons the courage to call the police. The police come, they conduct an investigation, they produce a voluminous report, just like those scores of human rights reports that have been produced over the past 20 years describing that crime against humanity, Israel's blockade of Gaza, describing Israel's multiple war crimes and crimes against humanity, that it committed in the course of its periodic high-tech killing sprees in Gaza, Operation Protective Edge, Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense, and on and on. All these reports condemning what Israel has done in Gaza, all the condemnations of the illegal blockade that Israel has imposed on Gaza, all the reports, voluminous, meticulous, authoritative, and what happened to them? They were all just placed in drawers to collect dust. So, she called the police. They did nothing. And then, one day, call it October 7th, her spouse is approaching her. Another torture, another brutalization, another agony. Well, this time she reaches for the kitchen knife and she stabs him. And she stabs him again. And she stabs him a third time. He then reaches for his pistol and he kills her. Now, as you most of you know, in a court of law, he probably would win on the grounds of self-defense. He had a right to self-defense. But as a moral principle, you know, Martin Luther King liked to quote Saint Augustine, "An unjust law is no law at all." An unjust law is no law at all. You'll see him quoting Augustine in the letter from a Birmingham jail. In any event, did he have a right to self-defense? Did he have a right to kill her? Or after 2 decades of brutalizing, tormenting, torturing that woman, he had forfeited his right to self-defense? Okay, I will leave it at that, and then we can proceed with participation from you.
Thank you very much, Professor Finkelstein, for those eloquent and important remarks. I just want to make a few quick announcements before we move on to Q&A. First of all, for those in attendance, if you're interested, we're having an event on January 31st at 11 a.m. Eastern US time, featuring Professor Mohammed Marandi, who will also speak about the genocide in Gaza. So I'll share the Zoom link for that in the chat if anyone is interested. Secondly, I'll announce another quick event. This one is a little bit further away on April 11th, but I want to announce it in case people want to mark their calendars. On April 11th, in person at the Community Church in Boston, we will have Dennis Fritz speaking about his book, Deadly Betrayal, The Truth About Why the U.S. Invaded Iraq, featuring Dennis Fritz, who was a Command Chief Master Sergeant of the U.S. Air Force, and he'll be joined in person in Boston with Lawrence Wilkerson, who wrote the foreword of his book and who was a colonel of the U.S. Army, and he was Chief of Staff to Colin Powell. So those are 2 events I want to announce. January 31st, featuring Mohammed Marandi on Zoom, and April 11th, in person at Community Church, featuring Dennis Fritz and Lawrence Wilkerson. I just want to say very quickly, thank you to Madeline for sending us some dollars in the YouTube chat. And thank you to a user named Master Shake for also sending us some money in the chat. This gives me an opportunity to say that if you found tonight's program valuable, and if you want to support us to keep on doing this, please donate to the community church. And I will also share a PayPal donation link in the chat where people can donate. And my last announcement, but not least, while we have all these people listening from around the world, I just want to say happy birthday to my cousin Zohaib. So happy birthday, and I hope you're having a good one. We're going to get into Q&A now, and I already see a lot of questions in the chat, in the Zoom chat, in the YouTube chat, and I'm making a note of all of them. Very important, insightful, and thoughtful questions. So I just want to say that sorry in advance that we won't be able to get to all of them, but I'll do my best. Professor Finkelstein, for the first question, I'm going to read off to you. This one comes from a medical doctor from the United Kingdom. And he's asking two questions, which a lot of people are asking. One question is, Professor Finkelstein, what are your thoughts about the so-called ceasefire agreement, with the ceasefire being announced, but the genocide still continuing? What is the future for innocent Palestinians? And a second question is, what do you think will happen with the change in the US government and a new president coming into office?
I don't claim to be an expert on the current round of negotiations that climaxed in this ceasefire agreement. I've, of course, read the agreement, the text, and I've read some commentary, but I didn't follow it very closely. I was working on a book on Gaza, which was preoccupying me. My basic feeling, I don't want to quote a feeling. My basic understanding is the following. Number one, there is an interesting analogy to what just happened with the ceasefire. I suspect nobody among your viewers and listeners will know that on January 17th, that is today, January 17th, 2009, Operation Cast Lead ended. That was the Israeli assault on Gaza. At the time, it seemed like a very large assault. It lasted from December 26th till January 17th. What Amnesty International called 22 days of death and destruction. And you know why it ended? It's an interesting story of great relevance with the recent developments in Gaza. It ended because President Obama was going to be inaugurated president. And he didn't want this sideshow in Gaza to distract attention from his coronation. And so he told Israel, end the attack, and it did. Very obediently, it did as the master ordered them being Israel, to do. In the current situation, as you will recall, about a month ago, President Trump announced that if the hostages were not released at the time of his inauguration, there would be all hell to pay. Now, President Trump, he didn't want to begin his presidency by having to unleash a savage assault on Gaza, first of all, because the people of Gaza had already paid hell in the past 15 months. So there wasn't much more that he could do. And secondly, because he didn't want to begin his presidency on such a merciless, heartless note. And so he read the Riot Act, or his emissary read the Riot Act to Netanyahu, as in signed the agreement which apparently doesn't differ in any significant way from the agreement that was agreed to in May of this past year. And it ended. The lesson to be learned from there is when an American president says stop, it stops. All this talk about Americans having no power, that Netanyahu doesn't listen, that, and so on. It's just nonsense. Now, having said that, as you know, there are two components to the ceasefire. One is the mutual hostage exchange, the thousands of hostages that are being held by Israel versus the 100 or less hostages currently being held by Hamas. There is the hostage exchange, but there is also a second aspect. That is the promise of admitting humanitarian aid on a high level, they say 600 trucks per day, allowing for the reconstruction of Gaza and all the rest. For those who don't know the history, lifting the blockade of Gaza, allowing for the reconstruction of Gaza and all the rest, it was promised after Operation Cast Lead. It was promised after Israel assaulted the humanitarian flotilla, the Mavi Marmara. It was promised after Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012. It was promised after Operation Protective Edge in 2014, and nothing came of it. As at the time of Operation Pillar of Defense, the defense minister was Ehud Barak, and he said they were signing an agreement to end the operation, these high-tech killing sprees. They were signing an agreement, and it included a ceasefire plus the lifting or the easing of the blockade. And at the time, Barak told the other Israeli officials who were debating whether to sign the ceasefire plus the end of the blockade or the easing of the blockade, he said, quote, "A day after the ceasefire, no one will remember what is written in that agreement." I think that's absolutely correct. I think after the ceasefire and the exchange, the mutual exchange of hostages between Israel and Hamas, all the promises about admitting humanitarian aid and allowing for the reconstruction in Gaza all of that will vanish like snow in a spring sunshine. It won't happen.
Professor, I was very young in 1994, but recently I read an article about Baruch Goldstein, and it mentioned in the article, in addition to being a medical doctor, he also apparently in his free time used to tutor or educate autistic children, apparently. And I was just wondering, I want to ask you, why did he go in and kill those worshipers? And also, why is he considered a hero among some Israelis, such as Itamar Ben-Gvir, who has his picture hung up in his home or in his office?
Uh, you know, I was once debating a historian, Israel's most prominent historian. His name is Benny Morris. And he said, well, you have to understand the Israeli mentality. I said to him, you know what, Professor Morris, I really don't want to understand. I don't want to get inside their heads. I really don't. They're crazy. I don't I don't think I can. And even if I could, I wouldn't want to enter the mindset of a lunatic. And it's my opinion that at this point, Israel's not a, it's always leftists in particular like to make the distinction between the state and society. And in some cases, that distinction is valid. So, for example, at least during the height of the anti-war movement in the 1960s and early 1970s, during the height of the anti-war movement, it's true the state did not represent American society. There was a substantial percentage of the American society, at least half and maybe more, that opposed the horrors, excuse me, that were being inflicted on Vietnam. So, in that instance, the distinction was valid. But there's no significant distinction to be made between the actions and the mindset of the Israeli state and Israeli society. It's a lunatic, not just a lunatic state, it's a lunatic society. We know that just by the fact that the Israeli soldiers freely post on the social media the horrors that they are carrying out in Gaza, knowing full well that posting these horrors on the social media will not only not cause them to be ostracized by Israeli society, but quite the contrary. The Israelis revel, relish, are euphoric at the unfolding genocide in Gaza.
I had the opportunity earlier today to speak very briefly with a previous speaker of Community Church who was a retired ambassador. And I mentioned to him that you'll be speaking with the church tonight, and if you had any suggestions for me for questions to ask you. So this is the question he suggested to me to ask you. Professor Finkelstein, what is your thoughts about the hope or the possibility or the likelihood of us as a global community achieving for Palestinians to achieve self-determination in the future?
Well, you can't really speak about us as a global community. There's the world of states and power, which failed Gaza miserably the past 15 months This was the first uh, genocide in real time, broadcast all across the social media, and the power of states did virtually nothing, with obviously honorable exceptions like South Africa, did virtually nothing to defend the humanity of the people of Gaza. I would say the three outstanding exceptions were South Africa, the Houthis in Yemen, and the Hezbollah, each of which uh, undertook what came to be called 1990s R2P, responsibility to protect. And this doctrine of R2P, responsibility to protect, essentially stated that when the normal instruments to preserve international law cease to function or become dysfunctional, then it's the responsibility of other parties to protect, in particular, those who are being subjected to a genocide. And with the exception of the Houthis, the Hezbollah, and South Africa, nobody rose to the occasion. On the other hand, it's true to say that popular public sentiment, even in the United States, was overwhelmingly opposed to what Israel was doing in Gaza.
Professor, some have characterized the current leaders of Syria as extremists, radicals who are backed by the United States and or Turkey and somehow in support of Israel. What is your view
I
of this?
can't speak on Syria. I'm not knowledgeable enough.
Okay. All right. Um, how about Turkey? Could you speak on Turkey?
No, no, I would have to have done a lot more work than I've done. I don't believe in speaking on subjects where I don't know more than the average layperson.
Okay. Well, in your book here, Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom, uh, I remember reading a point where you mentioned how even Hamas was ready to accept a two-state solution and Israel wasn't. And I wondered, oh, why doesn't Israel want a two-state solution?
Well, Israel wants a two-state solution, but well, it used to. It used to, now it doesn't. But it was never along the terms on what the international community had agreed on. The terms were very straightforward, not complicated at all. You can read those terms in the International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion of July 2004. The basic principles laid out in lucid, uncontroversial prose are: number one, the Palestinians constitute a people, and as a people, under international law, they have the right to self-determination. Number two, the whole of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, constitute occupied Palestinian territory. Number three, the settlements that Israel has built in the West Bank are all, down to the last, illegal under international law. And number four, that the conflict should be resolved by two states living side by side in peace. Those are the terms of the international consensus. Now, Israel has refused to fully withdraw from the territories it occupied in 1967. Israel has refused to dismantle all the settlements it's built in the West Bank. Israel has refused to withdraw fully from East Jerusalem. And now, as of, you say, the last 15 years, Israel has even refused a token Palestinian state. So the obstacle, judging by the consensus of the international community on how to resolve the conflict, the obstacle is Israel's refusal to abide by international law.
Can you speak to the condition of the Palestinians who are in Israeli prisons, which includes women and children?
Well, now it's thousands. Thousands of people have been rounded up. Judging by the human rights reports, they've been subjected, among other things, to sexual violence up to and including rape. That all of it is, it's not bad apples. It's all been sanctioned, or sanctioned in the sense of approved by the senior leadership in Israel. And large numbers of people were simply rounded up as hostages. They were randomly taken by Israel and are being held to be released in a hostage exchange. They're what you might call, and what Israel has in the past called, they're just being used, thousands of Palestinians. They're just being used as bargaining chips. There's no pretense. There's not only no pretense that they committed a crime, there's not only is there no pretense that there has been any kind of legal adjudication of their status, a trial, evidence, and so forth. There's not even the pretense they've committed a crime. They were just randomly collected.
Why did Israel attack the USS Liberty in 1967?
I don't think that's an important point now. That just goes back. We're talking about a half century ago. I have my own views on why they attacked it, but most people in your audience will never have even heard of the Liberty. There have been so many horrors since 1967. It's just ancient history at this point.
You and others have commented before October 7th on, quote, the punishment of Gaza, uh, that Israel wants to punish the people of Gaza. What crime did the people of Gaza commit that deserves punishment?
Well, first of all, we have to go back a ways. Uh, Israel has always sought, when I say always, I mean since 1967, they have sought to divide the Gaza from the West Bank. In the first place, physically, which began in 1990 under a policy that was called the closure policy, which made it more and more difficult for people to travel freely from Gaza to the West Bank. And the assumption was if you weaken the physical link between the West Bank and Gaza, you would also weaken the political unity of the West Bank and Gaza, and thereby it would make any kind of settlement along the lines of the international consensus, namely two states on the June 1967 border. It would make that settlement that much weaker because Israel can always claim, who are we supposed to negotiate with? There's one leadership in Gaza, there's another leadership in the West Bank, the so-called Palestinian Authority. So Israel would have new pretexts for not negotiating a settlement. So Israel has always sought to isolate the Gaza from the West Bank. And then secondly, Gaza has or had resisted Israel's attempts to impose its own rule or its rule after 1993 under its surrogates, namely the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And in 2006, the Palestinians in Gaza, they voted out the Palestinian Authority and voted in Hamas, which had run on a platform of reform because the Palestinian Authority is so corrupt. And when they elected Hamas into office, they had to be punished for having elected the wrong party into power.
The high amount of people and civilians that are killed by Israel, defenders of Israel often explain it as, or justified by saying that, well, Hamas uses them as human shields. In your book and others in their work have commented that there isn't really documented cases of that, but there is documented cases of Israel using Palestinians as human shields to search buildings or to do other things. Do you think, Professor, it's a fair characterization that much of what Israel accuses Hamas and Palestinians of, they themselves are guilty of?
Yes, I think that's completely accurate. I would say there have been in the past rounds, Operation Protective Edge, Operation Cast Lead, no evidence of Hamas using Palestinians as human shields, zero. In the current round, there have been like a couple of really trivial, in my opinion, stupid pieces of evidence being adduced. So, for example, in one case which received a lot of publicity, there were some Hamas militants in the home. There were Israelis in the home. One of the Hamas militants used a member, the household member, as a human shield, but not to escape. He used her, if you can call it that, in order to go to the Israelis to negotiate an end to the battle that was ensuing. So he went straight to the Israelis with the quote unquote human shield. But in that context, human shield just doesn't make any sense to use that term. He went to the Israelis with her and then talked to them. So that was one. And there was another incident which strikes me as just so totally trivial. But as you say, Israelis use routinely Palestinians as human shields to protect them if they think a house is being booby-trapped or this or that. They routinely use the Palestinians as human shields. And with that, I think I'm going to leave because it's 8:30. I promised you an hour and a half, and I delivered as I promised. So thank you for inviting me, and I wish you all the very best.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Finkelstein, and thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight. So everyone, please have a good night.